For 90 years, the French government classified this disaster as a military secret. On the night of December 12, 1917, somewhere between 675 and 800 soldiers burned alive inside a runaway train in the French Alps. Their driver had begged not to go. He'd been threatened at gunpoint. And when it was over, the press was ordered to say nothing. The largest newspaper in France gave it 21 lines, 4 days late. By the time the truth emerged, nearly a century had passed, and the memorial at the crash site still carried the wrong number of dead. This is the story of the Saint-Michel-de-Maurienne disaster, the troop train France tried to erase, and why. By the end of this video, you'll know 3 things. Why a train carrying 1,000 soldiers was sent down a mountain with almost no brakes. What happened during the 6.5 kilometers, nobody could stop it. And why France buried the truth for longer than most of those soldiers had been alive. To understand the night of December 12th, you have to understand what was happening on the Italian front. 6 weeks earlier, the Battle of Caporetto had shattered the Italian lines. Between late October and mid-November 1917, German and Austro-Hungarian forces punched through at the upper Isonzo River and drove the Italian army back more than 150 kilometers. Italy nearly collapsed. Entire divisions disintegrated. France and Britain rushed reinforcements south through the Alpine passes to prop up what remained. 6 French divisions crossed into Italy, roughly 100,000 men. And by late November, the line held. The crisis passed. But now the French High Command had a different problem. Morale. Earlier that year, mutinies had swept the French army after the disastrous Nivelle offensive. Entire units had refused to fight. Some refused to even leave their trenches. The generals learned a hard lesson that spring. Soldiers who never go home eventually stop caring whether they come back. So when the Italian crisis stabilized, a rail transport plan was organized. Rotate the exhausted troops out of Italy, through the Alps, and into France for leave. Give them a few days with their families. Remind them what they're fighting for. The men boarding train 612 at Modane on the night of December 12th were heading home for the first time in months. They'd survived Caporetto. They'd earned this journey. The route ran from Modane, sitting high in the Alps at roughly 1,000 meters elevation, down through the Maurienne Valley to Saint-Michel-de-Maurienne, about 330 meters lower. The descent covered approximately 13 kilometers on a continuous gradient of 3.3%, a 33 per mile slope that railwaymen treated with deep respect. Trains on this stretch were held to a strict speed limit of 40 kilometers per hour. Remember that number. In a few minutes, it's going to decide who lives and who dies. On the night of December 12th, train 612 was being assembled at Modane station. It was cold, it was dark, and the platform was chaos. Hundreds of soldiers, exhausted, elated, desperate to get home, crowded onto the train. Many had no assigned seat, some had no ticket at all. They were hitchhikers, men who'd found space on an overcrowded leave train and climbed aboard, hoping no one would ask questions. The original plan called for 2 separate trains, each behind its own locomotive. Standard procedure for a mountain descent with this many men. But a local military transport officer, sources identify him as Captain Fayol, though the exact identity remains debated among historians, made a decision that would kill hundreds of men. A munitions train also needed to go down the valley that night, and it needed a locomotive, so the second engine was pulled from the troop train and reassigned to haul ammunition. Ammunition, apparently, mattered more than soldiers. 2 trains worth of men were coupled together into a single formation. 19 wooden coaches, packed with roughly 1,000 soldiers, hooked behind one 460 locomotive. The train now weighed around 526 tons. That was 4 times the safe load for one engine on that gradient. Here is the detail that matters most. Of those 19 coaches, only the first 3 had air brakes, pneumatic brakes connected to the locomotive, the kind the driver could actually control from his cab. The remaining 16 coaches had hand brakes, Crude iron wheels that a brakeman had to physically crank, car by car, in the open air, in the dark, in December, on a moving train. Some of those coaches had no functional brakes at all, and for this entire 19-car formation, only 7 brakemen were assigned, 7 men to hold back 500 tons on a mountain. Think about what that actually means. Adjutant Girard, the driver sitting in the locomotive cab, could apply brakes to exactly 3 coaches. 16 coaches behind those 3 were dead weight. They would push, and nothing connected to Girard's controls could push back. If the train began to accelerate on that gradient, those 7 brakemen, scattered across 19 cars in freezing darkness, would have to crank their hand wheels hard enough to grip the rails. All of them, simultaneously. Perfectly. With no way to coordinate, no way to communicate, and no second chance. Girard knew this route. He'd driven it before. He looked at the manifest, looked at what they'd given him for brakes, and refused to go. He said the train was a death sentence on that gradient. He made it clear, on the record, that the braking power was catastrophically insufficient, and according to multiple historical accounts, he was threatened at gunpoint. One source names the officer who gave the order. Others describe the threat as court-martial. The details differ. The outcome doesn't. Girard drove. The train pulled out of Modane station just before midnight. Inside the wooden coaches, soldiers slept on benches, leaned against one another in the cold, lit candles and oil lamps against the alpine dark. Many of them had no idea they were descending one of the steepest rail gradients in France behind a fraction of the brakes they needed. For the first few minutes, the locomotive's brakes held. The 3 air-braked coaches responded. The gradient tugged, but the train moved at a manageable speed. Then the mountain took over. 526 tons on a 3.3% grade has a relentless arithmetic. The locomotive's brakes clamped the first 3 coaches, but the 16 behind them began to push. The coupling links went taut. The mass behind Girard started winning. The 7 brakemen cranked their hand wheels with everything they had. Metal ground against metal. Sparks sprayed from the rails in the December darkness. But physics doesn't negotiate. Not on a mountain, not at 500 tons. The speed crept past 40 kilometers per hour, the limit for this stretch. Past 50, past 60. By now, Girard would have known. He'd warned them. He'd told them exactly what would happen. And it was happening. The brakemen couldn't hold. Their hand wheels were designed for gentle stops on flat ground, not for fighting gravity with a train 4 times the safe weight, past 80 kilometers per hour. The coaches began to sway. The wooden frames groaned. 1,000 soldiers, most of them asleep, had no idea. The ones who were awake would have felt the rocking, the unnatural lean on the curves, the shriek of brakes that weren't biting. Some of them would have understood. Past 100. Past 120. The speed limit was 40. The train was doing triple. Would you have stayed in that cab? Girard couldn't stop what was behind him. He could only watch the valley rush toward him at a speed no train on this line had ever reached. Picture the geography. A narrow alpine valley, a rail line carved into the mountainside, curving with the contour of the rock. Wooden coaches built for peacetime crawls through the French countryside, not for 135 km/h plunge through mountain curves. The first coach hit the curve approaching Saint-Michel-de-Maurienne at roughly 135 km/h, more than 3 times the speed limit. It left the rails instantly, and then the 16 coaches behind it had nowhere to go. They telescoped. That's the word engineers use for what happens when a chain of rail cars slams into a sudden stop at catastrophic speed. Each car rams into the one ahead, crushing, folding, compressing. But wooden coaches don't telescope like modern steel carriages. They shatter. They explode into jagged walls of splintered timber that impale everything inside them. 19 coaches became 14 mangled heaps of wreckage in seconds, and then the fire started. The soldiers had been carrying open flames, candles, oil lamps, small fires to keep warm in the freezing alpine night. It was December in the mountains. Of course they had fire. When the coaches shattered, those flames met 500 tons of splintered dry wood. The wreckage ignited almost instantly. 14 coaches worth of timber, fabric, packs and uniforms, all of it fuel. In the dark of the Maurienne Valley, the remains of train 612 became an inferno. The fire burned so hot that the steel wheel frames warped. It burned so long that rescue teams arriving from Saint-Michel-de-Maurienne couldn't get within 100 meters for hours. Villagers who heard the crash and ran toward the sound were driven back by the heat. Soldiers who had survived the impact, men who were conscious, trapped in the wreckage, unable to move, burned alive. The screams carried across the valley floor, and there was nothing that anyone who heard them could do about it. The fire burned so hot that the steel wheel frames warped. It burned so long that rescue teams arriving from Saint-Michel-de-Maurienne couldn't get within 100 meters for hours. Villagers who heard the crash and ran toward the sound were driven back by the heat. Soldiers who had survived the impact, men who were conscious, trapped in the wreckage, unable to move, burned alive. The screams carried across the valley floor, and there was nothing that anyone who heard them could do about it. When the count was attempted, the fire had made it nearly impossible. The official figure, the number the French military would report, was 435 dead. But that number was a fabrication, and everyone involved knew it. Only about 425 bodies were ever identified. The rest had burned beyond recognition. Later historical analyses, demographic reconstructions, and independent assessments converge on a much higher figure, at least 675 dead. Some estimates push past 800. The gap exists because many soldiers had boarded without official permission. Men who hitched a ride on an overcrowded leave train, men whose names appeared on no manifest. When you're not on the list, nobody counts you among the dead. Within hours of the crash, the French military classified the entire incident as a military secret. The country was at war, the mutinies were still raw. The last thing the High Command wanted was for French citizens, or French soldiers still in the field, to learn that their own military had loaded 1,000 men into a death trap and pushed them down a mountain without brakes. The press was gagged. Wartime censorship ensured total compliance. The largest French newspaper of the era, Le Figaro, published 21 lines about the disaster. 4 days late, 21 lines for the deadliest rail accident in French history, 21 lines for 700 dead. A military court-martial was convened. 6 employees of the PLM, the Paris-Lyon Méditerranée Railway that operated the line, were put on trial. Not the transport officer who requisitioned the second locomotive, not the officer who held a gun on Girard. The railwaymen, the men who'd warned this would happen, and all 6 were acquitted. Girard, the driver who'd refused and been forced, walked free. It was the single honest outcome in a process built to deflect blame downward. 6 years later, in 1923, the French Minister of Defense, André Maginot, the same man whose name would later be attached to France's doomed defensive line, inaugurated a quiet memorial at the Saint-Michel-de-Maurienne cemetery. The dead were honored as victims of war. The facts remained classified. Decades passed. Survivors aged and died. The story faded from living memory into footnotes. In 1961, the remains were exhumed and transferred to the National Military Cemetery at Lyon-la-Douai. They joined other war dead, given permanent rest, but the circumstances of their deaths remained unspoken. And it wasn't until 1998, 81 years after the fire, that a public monument was finally unveiled at La Saussaz, near the actual crash site. It lists the names that could be recovered. And beside those names, it carries the old official figure, 425, not 675, not the number historians and researchers have settled on. The number the military invented in December 1917 to make the catastrophe look smaller. Every death on train 612 was preventable. If the second locomotive hadn't been requisitioned, the brakes would have held. If the train had been split into two as originally planned, neither half would have exceeded the safe load. If the 7 brakemen had been 30, or if the coaches had had air brakes, the descent would have been routine. If Adjutant Girard's warning had been heeded instead of silenced with a weapon, the train would never have left Modane. Somewhere between 675 and 800 men died because one officer needed a locomotive for ammunition, and another decided that a driver's expertise mattered less than a gun. The Saint-Michel-de-Maurienne derailment remains France's deadliest rail disaster. In the annals of railway history, it is surpassed only by the 2004 Sri Lanka tsunami train wreck. And that was a natural disaster, not a human decision. In purely operational terms, a train, a track, and the choices people made. Saint-Michel-de-Maurienne stands alone. France classified this disaster. The press was muzzled. The death toll was halved. The railwaymen were blamed and then acquitted. The officers who made the decisions were never charged. The monument still carries the wrong number, but the Maurienne Valley remembers. The curve at Saint-Michel-de-Maurienne is still there, cut into the same rock. The gradient hasn't changed. It's still 3.3%, still demanding respect from every train that descends it. And the names of the men who burned on that mountain, at least the 425 they could identify, are carved into stone that the French government spent nearly a century pretending didn't need to exist. If stories like this deserve to be remembered, consider subscribing, because the ones that were buried deepest are usually the ones that matter most. Here's a question worth sitting with. If you were Adjutant Girard, if a man with a gun told you to drive a train you knew would kill everyone behind you, what would you do? And would anyone remember that you tried to stop it? If this cover-up unsettled you, the story of the Quintin-Sill disaster, Britain's worst rail crash, where 2 signalmen's lies sent 230 soldiers to their deaths, started the same way. A warning ignored, a truth buried. That one's next.